Hello and welcome to our podcast on sports and world history. Today we will be discussing the evolution of women in sports in the United States. We'll start by introducing the origins, walking through monumental turning points, taking you through the history of U.S. women in the Olympics, and finally discussing modern accomplishments and the continuing fight for equality. Stick around to the end for an exclusive interview with former collegiate athlete Lily Gregory. When I first think about the topic of women in sports in the United States, packed stadiums and gold medals come to mind. But it wasn't always this way. And in fact, there was a lot of pushback at the idea of women participating in sports in the early 1900s. My name is Emily Hutchings, and I will be discussing how early societal pressures on women dramatically shaped the origin of female sports in the United States. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern-day Olympics, was famous for organizing the 1896 Olympic Games in which not a single female athlete was featured. And this was no mistake. In his own words, Pierre de Coubertin believed that allowing female athletes to compete would be, quote, unpractical, uninteresting, ungainly, and improper. Now, he was not alone in these thoughts, as there were many people who opposed female athletics for a variety of different reasons. Mainly, the expectations for women during that time were to be modest and feminine, marry a husband and have children, and be a homemaker. Now, we see many female athletes today who can do it all, but at that time, sports and this perception of women playing a domestic role was considered to be mutually exclusive. Some people also believed that participating in sports could affect fertility. There was this idea dating all the way back to Aristotle that claimed a female had a certain amount of energy flowing through her body, and playing a sport or even studying long hours in school would cause the energy to drain, thus making them infertile. Now, this ideology is outlandish to think about today, but it clearly shows that women were objectified by societal standards back in the day. Now, the most important value that society placed on women was the ability to have children, and that anything that hindered that ability was opposed. So finally, bringing it back to Pierre de Coubertin, he also believed that only people who would watch or support women's sports would be doing so for their own sexual desires. Now, these ideas and thoughts were so deeply ingrained into society that when women wanted to participate in sports, they needed to do so in a way that fit in with the culture around them. So for instance, Sarah Berenson, the creator of women's basketball in 1892, had to take the playbook of men's basketball created just a year prior and modify the rules to align with the standards set for women. Now, these adjustments to the rules were aimed at reducing physicality, increasing modesty, and excluding competitive and unfeminine behaviors such as snatching or stealing the ball. While the creation of basketball for women was a step in the right direction, the need to, in my opinion, dull down the game for the acceptance of the country shows the significance that these societal pressures had in limiting female sport at its early stages. So the early 1900s is really where we start to see a shift in the expectation of women in society, and where the topic of equality between males and females starts to grow. And especially in the 1920s, or in 1920, we see a great win with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And all of these changing viewpoints and these changing expectations are reflected in the growth of women's sports, which really started to take off during this time period, 1930s, and around there. So in the 1900s, early 1900 to 1910, women were still mostly bound by the pressure to play a domestic role in the household. But we start seeing here more women participating in country club sports, such as tennis and swimming. Now, these sports were common as values of femininity could be upheld by modest fashion. So, in fact, in the early 1900s, we saw ladies donning corsets and floor-length skirts with decorative hats and gloves to play tennis. But just 30, 40 years later, we start to see these outfits exchanged out for knee-length skirts and high-waisted shorts, prioritizing mobility instead of modesty. This new era in the 1930s and 40s ushered in a spirit of energetic athleticism and spirited sexuality to the stage of female athletics. Now, this growth is something we will continue to see in our next discussions, and something Liam will continue to talk about advancements in the sport of tennis next. But before we move on to that discussion, it's important to highlight that the introduction of women's athletics was not easy, and indeed it took a long time to grow into the representation we see today. It's also important to note that even though women's sports started to grow in the 1900s, not all women were included. White and upper-class females were the main individuals who were able to participate at its early inception. And now this is something, the origin of women's sports in the United States, that I find really important to talk about because it showcases a very powerful quality of sports, the ability to magnify inequalities that come from social structure. At its origin, sports were simply used as a means to enforce the cultural expectations of women at the time, until they couldn't anymore.
Thank you, Emily, for the introduction to the origin of women's sports in the U.S. My name is Liam Kubacki, and I'll now shift our focus towards major turning points. When we talk about the history of women's sports in the United States, one name rises again and again, Billie Jean King, not just as a champion on the tennis court, but as someone who constantly pushed the entire sports world forward. Her story is inseparable from the fight for gender equity, and in her own words, if you see it, you can be it. It's what your parents did, it's what your role models did. What you saw, not what they said. That idea of visibility, representation, of doors being opened, echoes throughout her entire career. Her fight really took shape in 1970 with a group known simply as the Original Nine. At the time, women in tennis were battling massive pay disparities. Prize money was a fraction of what the male players received, sometimes less than 1/8. Tournament directors didn't take the women seriously, and the sport was structured so that the success of women could never match the opportunities given to men. Billie Jean King didn't just accept that. She organized, she recruited, and along with 8 other women, Rosie Castles, Nancy Ritchie, Carrie Melville, Peaches Barkowitz, Judy Dalton, Valerie Ziegenfuss, Christy Pigeon, and Julie Heldman, she signed a symbolic $1 contract with promoter Gladys Heldman. It was an act of rebellion and an act of creation. Together they risked being banned from the tennis world to form what became the Virginia Slim Circuit, the first step towards a truly independent women's professional tour. Just 2 years later, a national shift helped fuel that momentum. Title IX passed in 1972. For the first time, educational institutions receiving federal funding were required to provide equal opportunities regardless of sex. Suddenly, access to sports, scholarships, and athletic programs became opening for millions of girls. Billie Jean King didn't just support Title IX, she championed it loudly and relentlessly. She was one of the most influential public defenders at a time when it faced heavy backlash. Her philosophy is reflected again in a quote, "When you oppress people, either by gender, by race, by sexual orientation, the doors become ajar." To her, Title IX was that door becoming ajar, and women were ready to burst through that door. In 1973, during the height of the women's liberation movement and the push for equal play in tennis, Bobby Riggs, a 55-year-old former world number 1 and publicly outspoken sexist, issued a challenge, a match against Billie Jean King. He called her the leading women's libber of tennis. He claimed that beating her would set the women's movement back. Billie, however, ignored him, so Margaret Court accepted. Court was one of the greatest women's players in history, a 22-time Grand Slam champion who had won 89 of her last 92 matches. But on Mother's Day at St. Vincent Country Club in California, Riggs defeated her 6-2, 6-1 in what became known as the Mother's Day Massacre. And immediately after, Riggs challenged Billie Jean King again. This time, she accepted. On September 20th, 1973, the world watched as Billie Jean King faced Bobby Riggs in what became known as the Battle of the Sexes. More than 30,000 people filled the Houston Astrodome, the largest American tennis crowd ever. and 50 million Americans tuned into the live broadcast, with 90 million viewers worldwide. The stakes were far bigger than the $100,000 prize. Title IX had just passed, and the Virginia Slims Tour was gaining momentum. But Riggs' win over Court had energized those who oppose women's equality in sports. Billie Jean King later said, "I thought it would set us back 50 years if I didn't win the match. It would ruin the women's tennis tour and affect all of women's self-esteem." Riggs continued mocking women's tennis leading up to the match. He even signed a $500,000 deal with Sugar Daddy, entering the arena wearing a jacket, promoting the brand, and carrying a giant lollipop. King, however, stayed focused, and she won. 6-4, 6-3, 6-3, defeating Riggs in straight sets. It was one of the most important symbolic victories in the history of women's athletics. The impact of the Battle of Sexes was immediate and long-lasting. The win fueled the push for equal prize money at the U.S. Open, which became the first major tournament to offer it. From 1970 to 1973, the USLTA, which was the association left by the original line, and the Virginia Slims Tour had been divided, but Billie Jean King lobbied tirelessly to unify them. In June 1973, at the Gloucester Hotel in London, 45 female players met and created a single association. King and her lawyer arrived prepared, bylaws drafted, and elections organized, determined not to leave the room without an agreement. That day, the Women's Tennis Association was officially formed, and later that same year, the U.S. Open awarded equal prize money, $25,000 each, to the men's and women's champions. Billie Jean King's victory over Riggs didn't just boost the women's movement. It made equality visible. It proved women could no longer be treated as second-class citizens. It gave women and girls everywhere a sense of new possibility. Her journey, from the original nine to Title IX to the Battle of the Sexes, marked the beginning of a new era in women's sports. She didn't just change tennis. She changed the landscape for women's sports entirely. She reminded us that progress happens when someone pushes, when someone risks, and when someone shows the world what's possible. And as she said, when the door finally cracks open, people rush through. They did, and they still are. Even with all this progress, there's still work to be done. And today's female athletes continue Billie Jean King's fight for equal rights and equal representation. We'll next take a further look at how American women in the Olympics contributed to this fight and left their mark on history.
Thank you, Liam, for the overview of the biggest legal and cultural turning points in the history of American women's sports. I'm Noah Shagrin, and I'll be going over the history of American women in the Olympics. As we learned in Emily's discussion of the origins of U.S. women's sports, Pierre de Coubertin, the creator of the modern Olympics, was not in favor of women's inclusion. Coubertin's influence shaped the first Olympics in 1896, where no women competed at all. By 1900, women were allowed in a very limited capacity, participating in just a few events like tennis and golf. However, it was clear that full inclusion was still far away in the early 20th century. With that being said, let's get into our first big Olympic landmark, Betty Robinson and the 1928 Olympic Games in Amsterdam. These games were a major breakthrough. For the first time, women were allowed to compete in track and field. This didn't happen on its own. It was a result of strong lobbying from the International Women's Sports Federation, known as the FSFI. They created Women's World Games in the 1920s, essentially a women-run alternative to the Olympics. These games weren't just competitions, they were a protest, aimed at pressuring the International Olympic Committee to expand women's opportunities. And it worked. In 1926, the International Association of Athletics Federations voted to include more women's events in the Olympics. Although the Federation recommended adding 10 events, the IOC only approved 5 for 1928. But despite these limitations, the 1928 Games produced one of the most iconic moments in U.S. women's Olympic history. 16-year-old Betty Robinson of the United States won the gold medal in the 100-meter dash and shattered the world record in the process. On top of that, the U.S. women's team medaled in 4 out of the 5 events that year. So, while 1928 marked real progress and broke major barriers, there was still a long road ahead for gender equality in the Olympics. For our second big landmark in the U.S. women's Olympic history, we're going to fast forward to 1972. This is the year that one of the most important pieces of legislation in sports history was passed, Title IX of the Education Amendments. As we learned from Liam's section about turning points, Title IX states that, quote, "No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." Title IX passed just before the 1972 Munich Olympics, where only about 21% of U.S. athletes were women. But from that moment on, women's participation in sports skyrocketed at every level, including the Olympics. One standout example of this growth came in the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta. American women earned gold medals across an incredible range of sports: swimming, gymnastics, shooting, track and field, softball, soccer, synchronized swimming, basketball, and tennis. It was one of the most dominant, wide-ranging performances by American women in Olympic history, and it was a direct reflection of the opportunities that Title IX had created. This upward trend in women's participation continued, setting us up for our third big landmark, the 2012 Olympics in London. The 2012 Games marked a turning point that would have been unimaginable in 1896. For the first time ever, the United States sent more women than men to the Olympics: 268 women, 262 men. And the women didn't just participate, they dominated. American women won 29 gold medals compared to the men's 17. These games made it undeniable. Women had become the driving force behind U.S. Olympic success. What's even more significant is that this wasn't a one-time anomaly. Ever since 2012, the U.S. has consistently sent more women to the Olympics, in Rio, in Tokyo, and again in Paris. Even with this progress, challenges remain, from disparities in media coverage to unequal representation in coaching and leadership roles. But when you zoom out and look at the past 125 years, the transformation is remarkable. From being excluded entirely, to forming their own World Games in protest, to the sweeping effects of Title IX, to finally outnumbering and outmedaling men on the Olympic stage, American women's representation in the Olympics has come a very long way. And the best part, the story is still being written.
Thank you, Noah, for that insightful overview of women in the Olympics. My name is Reagan Karlstrom, and for my segment, I'll be focusing on more recent history, highlighting not only how far women's sports have advanced, but also the work that remains to be done here in the United States. First, I'm going to begin with one of the most prominent achievements in recent years, and that's the fight for equal pay with women's soccer. The U.S. women's soccer team has had an unmatched record with winning 4 FIFA Women's World Cups and 4 Olympic gold medals. Their performance has consistently exceeded that of the men's team. However, the financial recognition has not reflected their success. An example of this came after the 2015 World Cup, where the women's team won. However, they only received a fraction of the bonuses compared to the men, who did not even make it to the World Cup. And to determine and address this disparity, the team took their fight to court, and in February of 2022, the team reached a landmark agreement with the U.S. Soccer Federation for a $24 million settlement, and most importantly, equal pay and prize money for both the men's and women's soccer team. This outcome also just goes beyond financial compensation. It shows how it's a victory for respect, as also setting a new standard in the world for women's athletics and what they deserve to be paid. However, we also see how soccer is not the only sport in which female athletes continue to fight for fairness. We see this with WNBA and college basketball, comparing also just WNBA salaries and NBA salaries, as well as just opportunities with men's and women's basketball. For example, in the 2021 NCAA March Madness tournament, there were photos put out onto the internet comparing both the men and women's weight room facilities, and we could see how the men's team was provided with power racks, Olympic bars, and a lot of equipment, whereas the women's team was only provided with dumbbells and yoga mats, more or less revealing how not only the prominent resource gap, but also the broader issue for a lack of opportunities for women in sports. With response to these setbacks, WNBA athletes have taken action by recently wearing shirts during warm-ups saying "Pay us what you owe us," and they're able to leverage their platform to protest and raise awareness for pay equity and also equal treatment to confront the systematic gender inequalities. However, there are also signs of progress and growing visibility, and we see this with notable athletes, and one of these being Caitlin Clark, beginning to shift public perception and also draw attention to women's sports and highlighting the good things women are able to achieve. But Caitlin Clark has challenged long-standing stereotypes and also demonstrating how women's sports deserve equal attention and resources. She has made history happen. For the first time ever last year, the women's NCAA championship game drew a larger television audience than the men's title, with nearly 19 million viewers. Basically, how Clark exemplifies the power and potential of women in sports, breaking barriers and setting new standards for representation. She inspires young athletes to break these imposed stereotypes of how some being women sports isn't as exciting as men, and how women are as athletic as men. And these are some of which Emily talked about earlier. But these prominent athletes like Caitlin Clark, like Simone Biles, like Serena Williams, prove how strong and capable women are, and they pave the way for future generations. Overall, just reflecting on these achievements for women, with the passing of Title IX and Billie Jean King to women being able to compete in the Olympics and modern-day achievements. It is significant the progress that has been made. However, there is continued advocacy still needed as women in sports are striving for the recognition and respect they deserve. The progress that we celebrate today is standing up for fairness and leads to a real change, bringing us closer to the future where equality in sports is not just a goal, but a reality. And thank you for listening to my segment of the podcast. I will now be passing it off to our guest interview.
So we're back, and I'm very excited to welcome our guest, Lily Gregory, to the podcast today. Lily is now a retired collegiate athlete from our very own NCAA Division I women's rowing team here at the University of Michigan. Among many other accomplishments, Lily is a two-time Big Ten champion and in 2023 qualified to compete in the NCAA championship, where she helped her team finish 7th in the nation. Thanks for joining us today, Lily.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Of course. Throughout the podcast, we've discussed the dramatic evolution of women's sports in the United States. And now we're excited to hear your perspectives on the topic. So diving right in, how has participating in sports, and especially at a collegiate level, impacted your life? And going off of that, why do you think it's crucial that women have the opportunity to participate in sports?
Yeah, rowing at a collegiate level has been really eye-opening. It's like working, not only rowing, but any collegiate sport is like working a 40-hour week on top of taking 12 to 18 credits of classes in order to graduate with a degree, especially here at Michigan. And it's taught me a lot about time management skills, how to apply myself, how I act, and how I am under high-stress situations. It's also really helped me in the sense of working in a team and as a group. Rowing is the ultimate team sport. Everything you do has to be together and in motion and in a certain time. So being able to navigate that realm and apply it to my day-to-day life has been really nice. I think for women in sports, just as a whole, it's super important that everyone gets the ability to do this, and ability to be outside or be inside and express themselves in the way they want and participate in what they want to participate in. And having the ability to do that in a team setting or on a sports team is super important and super cool.
Yeah, definitely. And now moving into a more grim topic, but have you experienced any discrimination as a female athlete?
I mean, yeah, a bit. It's not always as severe or dramatic as movies or shows can make it seem to be, but especially growing up, you are malleable as a child, and everyone has malleable opinions and viewpoints on sports. And in middle school and elementary school, boys seem to think only boys can play certain sports. And I got into an argument with someone and ended up joining the football team in middle school just out of spite because I was told women can't do the same thing that men can do. And it's important to realize that children are super, super prone to thinking and viewing and having opinions based on what they see in their day-to-day life. And for football, for example, that's typically a male-dominated sport. So seeing that, you're bound to believe that women can't do that, even though that's not the truth. And I did it for 2 years in middle school after that. So a little bit of discrimination, but at the college level, you really don't see the divide between male athlete and female athlete. It's really just athlete as a whole, and there tends to be a little bit more discrimination in areas as religion or race rather than male or female. And that's difficult in itself, and I've been lucky enough not to experience that, but I have seen it play out from time to time with different people on the team. It's just kind of sad and unfortunate to think that that's even something that can happen at this high of a level where you're competing at this pace and you're competing in this realm. That shouldn't even be something that plays into mind.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I guess kind of going off of that, we've discussed throughout the podcast, it's clear that there's been a lot of progress from the 1900s until now. But it seems that we're not done in progressing this field. So what kind of do you see as the future direction of women in sports?
Yeah, I think there's so much more that can happen with women in sports. It's super cool to see how the NHL is just now getting their first female coaches at such a high level, which is amazing and a huge step in the right direction. I think a great way to go is making sports more accessible, not only in the U.S., but worldwide, where there are many, many nations that women are unable to participate in these sports, or even in the U.S., where underprivileged or underdeveloped communities don't have the same access to sports as other communities do, just really making sports something more accessible and more widespread.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, making sure that the barriers or the racial and religious discrimination within the women in sports community, we kind of fix that problem as well. Well, thanks for joining us today, Lily.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning about the history of women's sports and gaining new insights into the games that continue to inspire us. The best is still yet to come for women in sports.